The rain hammered against my workshop windows like bullets from heaven, each drop carrying the weight of everything I'd learned to hate about this godforsaken town. I sat in my basement workshop, nursing my third whiskey of the night, surrounded by the tools of my trade, circular saws, nail guns, and measuring tapes that had built half the custom homes around Bass Lake. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent 15 years building dream houses for other people, while my own marriage crumbled like wet drywall. My name is Rowan Kerrick, and I'm what you might call a blue-collar genius with a military background and a mouth that gets me in trouble more often than it should. At 38, I've got calloused hands, a sharp tongue, and exactly zero patience for people who think they can play me for a fool. 3 months ago, my wife Reina walked out that front door with nothing but a suitcase and a story about finding herself. What she found was Luther Braddock's bed, but that's getting ahead of myself. The house felt different without her constant chatter about the fitness studio she ran downtown, her endless complaints about money, and her passive-aggressive comments about my lack of ambition. Funny how quiet can be both a blessing and a curse. In the silence, I'd started noticing things I'd missed before, like how she'd been working late every Tuesday and Thursday for months, or how her phone was suddenly more interesting than our conversations. I was contemplating the bottom of my glass when I heard the front door open upstairs. My first thought was that someone had broken in, because Reina had left her key on the kitchen counter the day she walked out. But then I heard her voice, that familiar mix of confidence and calculation that used to make my heart race and now just made my stomach turn. "Rowan, are you home?" I set down my whiskey and listened to her footsteps crossing the hardwood floors I'd installed myself. She was moving slowly, deliberately, like she was giving me time to process her presence. Smart woman, my soon-to-be ex-wife. She always did know how to stage an entrance. I climbed the stairs from my workshop, each step bringing me closer to whatever fresh nightmare she'd cooked up. When I reached the living room, there she was, Rowan Kerrick, in all her manipulative glory. She looked different, though. Softer around the edges, her usually perfect blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she was wearing one of those flowing dresses that seemed designed to hide something. "Hello, Rowan," she said, her voice carrying that fake sweetness she used when she wanted something. Well, I replied, leaning against the doorframe. "Look what the storm blew in. To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" She shifted uncomfortably, and that's when I noticed the suitcase by her feet. Not the same one she'd left with. This was bigger, more permanent looking. My contractor's eye automatically cataloged details: expensive leather, brass fittings, the kind of luggage that screamed, "I've been living well." "I need to talk to you," she said, then paused dramatically. "Luther's in prison." Now that was interesting. Luther Braddock, the sleazy real estate developer who'd been sniffing around my wife like a dog in heat, was apparently having some legal difficulties. I couldn't say I was surprised. The man had always struck me as the type who cut corners and greased palms to get his projects approved. "Gee, that's terrible news," I said, not bothering to hide my sarcasm. "What did they get him for? Tax evasion? Bribery? Or did he finally proposition the wrong judge's wife?" Reina's face flushed red. "It's not funny, Rowan. He's facing serious charges for embezzlement and fraud. The FBI raided his office last week." "And this affects me how exactly?" She took a deep breath, and I could see her gathering herself for whatever bombshell she was about to drop. "I'm pregnant, Rowan, and I need to come home." There it was. The punchline to a joke I should have seen coming from a mile away. My wife of 12 years had left me for a criminal, gotten herself knocked up, and now wanted to crawl back home because her sugar daddy was wearing an orange jumpsuit. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself another whiskey, taking my time to process this information. Through the window, I could see the lights of downtown Bass Lake twinkling in the distance, including the neon sign for her precious fitness studio. The place where she'd supposedly been building her empire while actually building a relationship with Luther. Congratulations, I said finally. When's the baby due? January, she replied, following me into the kitchen. Rowan, I know this is complicated, but… Complicated? I laughed, and it wasn't a pleasant sound. Reina, you walked out on our marriage to shack up with a man who's apparently been running a criminal enterprise, and now you want to come home because he can't pay your bills anymore. I'd say that's a little more than complicated. She set her purse on the counter, the same granite countertops I'd installed when we first bought this house, back when I thought we were building something together. I made mistakes, okay? But we're still married, and this baby needs a stable home. Your baby, I corrected, not mine. Let's be very clear about that. Rowan, please. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but I'm asking you to be the bigger person here. Take me back. Help me raise this child. We can make this work. I studied her face, looking for any trace of the woman I'd fallen in love with 15 years ago. She was still beautiful. Reina had always been the kind of woman who turned heads when she walked into a room, but now I could see the calculation behind her green eyes, the way she was measuring my reactions and adjusting her approach accordingly. Sit down, I said, gesturing to the kitchen table. Let's talk about this properly. Relief washed over her face as she took a seat. She probably thought she was winning, that her old charm was working its magic on me. Poor thing had no idea what she'd just walked into. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recorder app, setting it on the table between us. I want to make sure I understand the situation correctly, so let's start from the beginning. What's that for? She asked, eyeing the phone nervously. Insurance, I said. I've learned the hard way that conversations with you tend to get reinterpreted later. So let's make sure we're both on the same page. You left me 3 months ago for Luther Braddock, correct? Rowan, I don't think we need to… Answer the question, Reina. You left me for Luther Braddock. She sighed. Yes, I left you for Luther. But it wasn't just about him. Our marriage was falling apart, and you know it. Uh-huh. And during your time with Luther, you became pregnant with his child. Yes. And now that Luther's facing federal charges, you want to come back home and have me raise another man's baby as my own. When you put it like that, it sounds exactly like what it is, I interrupted. A business transaction. You're not here because you love me or because you want to save our marriage. You're here because your meal ticket got punched and you need a new one. Tears started forming in her eyes, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then, I remembered all the nights I'd eaten dinner alone while she was working late, all the times she'd come home smelling like expensive cologne that wasn't mine, all the lies she'd told with such practiced ease. That's not fair, she whispered. I do love you, Rowan. I never stopped loving you. Really? Is that why you've been living in Luther's lake house for the past 3 months? Is that why your fitness studio suddenly had the money for that expensive renovation? Is that why Sierra's been telling everyone at the Crooked Lantern that you and Luther were planning to get married as soon as our divorce was final? Her face went pale. You've been talking to Sierra? Honey, this is Bass Lake. Everybody talks to everybody. Did you really think you could carry on an affair with the most visible man in town and keep it quiet? The tears were flowing freely now, but I wasn't buying it. Reina had always been an accomplished actress when the situation called for it. Rowan, I made a mistake, a huge mistake. But people can change. I can change. You're right, I said, standing up and walking to the window. People can change. I've changed quite a bit these past 3 months, actually. Want to know how? She nodded, probably hoping I was about to declare my. She nodded, likely expecting me to profess lasting devotion and absolution. Love and forgiveness. I've learned to enjoy my own company. I've learned that a quiet house is actually pretty peaceful. I've learned that I don't need someone constantly criticizing my work, my clothes, my friends, or my lack of ambition. And most importantly, I've learned that I deserve better than being someone's backup plan. I turned back to face her, and the expression on my face must have told her everything she needed to know about where this conversation was heading. So here's what's going to happen, Reina. You're going to finish your coffee, take your suitcase, and find somewhere else to have your little breakdown. Because this house, this marriage, and this life you walked away from, they're not available for re-entry. You can't be serious, she said, her voice rising. Rowan, I'm pregnant and homeless. Luther's assets are frozen, and I don't have anywhere else to go. That sounds like a problem you should have considered before you decided to upgrade your husband. Maybe Sierra will let you crash at her place. I hear she's got a nice guest room. Reina stood up abruptly, knocking over her coffee cup. The dark liquid spread across the table like spilled ink, and I couldn't help but think it was a perfect metaphor for our marriage. I'm not leaving, she declared. This is my house too. I have rights. Actually, you don't, I said calmly. See, that's another thing I learned these past 3 months. I learned about property law. This house is in my name only, bought with money I earned before we got married. You never contributed a dime to the mortgage, and you sure as heck didn't contribute anything to the down payment. The color drained from her face as the reality of her situation began to sink in. You're lying. Am I? Feel free to call a lawyer and check. Oh, wait. You probably can't afford one now that your boyfriend's accounts are frozen. She grabbed her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. Fine. If that's how you want to play this, then we'll do it the hard way. She slammed the envelope on the table. Paternity papers. I'm claiming you as the father of this baby, and I'm demanding spousal support and child support. I picked up the envelope and examined it without opening it. Interesting strategy. There's just one small problem with it. What's that? Timeline, sweetheart. See, I might be a simple contractor, but I'm not stupid. You left me on March 15th. It's now June 20th. If you're due in January, that means you got pregnant in April at the earliest, which means this baby was conceived while you were living with Luther, not with me. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She'd clearly expected me to just roll over and accept responsibility, the way I'd done so many times before when she'd pushed the boundaries of our marriage. Besides, I continued, I've got something you don't have. What's that? I smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. Documentation. See, I might have been hurt and angry when you left, but I wasn't stupid. I kept track of everything. Every late night you claimed to be at the studio. Every weekend business trip you took with Sierra. Every time you came home smelling like another man's cologne. I walked to my home office and returned with a thick folder. Bank records showing large deposits into your business account that correspond with Luther's project approvals. Credit card statements showing purchases at restaurants and hotels where you were definitely not with me. And my personal favorite, security camera footage from the lake house that shows you and Luther together, with timestamps that prove when your affair really started. Reina stared at the folder like it was a venomous snake. You had me followed? I didn't have to. You weren't exactly subtle about it. Luther's lake house has a security system, and he was careless about who had access to the footage. Amazing what you can find when you know the right people. The fight seemed to go out of her then. She slumped back into her chair, her hands instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. What do you want, Rowan? I want you to leave. I want you to take your lies, your manipulation, and your other man's baby, and I want you to get out of my house. And if you try to drag me into court with false paternity claims or bogus support demands, I'll make sure every piece of evidence I've collected finds its way to the right people. What's that supposed to mean? It means Luther's not the only one facing legal troubles. Filing false paternity claims is fraud, Reina. Perjury if you do it under oath. And given that your boyfriend is already under federal investigation, I'm betting the prosecutors would be very interested in any additional criminal activity involving his associates. She stood up slowly, her face a mask of barely controlled rage. This isn't over, Rowan. I'll find a way to make you pay for this. Maybe, I said, walking to the front door and opening it. But not tonight. Tonight, you're leaving. She grabbed her suitcase and purse, pausing at the threshold to deliver what she probably thought would be a devastating parting shot. You'll regret this. When you're old and alone, you'll remember that you had a chance to do the right thing and chose revenge instead. The right thing? I laughed. Reina, the right thing would have been for you to honor your marriage vows. The right thing would have been for you to talk to me about our problems instead of running off with the first man who flashed some money at you. The right thing would have been for you to ask for a divorce before you started your affair. I stepped closer to her, close enough that she had to look up to meet my eyes. But you didn't do any of those things. You chose to lie, to cheat, and to humiliate me in front of the entire town. So don't you dare stand there and lecture me about doing the right thing. She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up my hand to stop her. We're done here, Reina. Don't come back. I closed the door and turned the deadbolt, listening as her heels clicked down the front steps and across the driveway. Through the window, I watched her throw her suitcase into the back of a car I didn't recognize. Probably a rental, since Luther's fancy cars were likely impounded along with everything else. As her taillights disappeared into the rainy night, I poured myself one more whiskey and sat down to think about what came next. Because if I knew Reina, and after 12 years of marriage, I definitely knew Reina, this was just the opening move in what was going to be a very ugly game. But here's the thing about games. I'd spent 3 months preparing for this moment. While she was playing house with Luther and planning their future together, I'd been documenting everything, building my case, and preparing for the day she'd come crawling back. She thought she was dealing with the same pushover she'd married 12 years ago. She was about to learn how wrong she was. The next morning dawned gray and miserable, which seemed appropriate given the circumstances. I'd barely slept, my mind churning through scenarios and contingencies like a computer running calculations. By 6 a.m., I was already in my workshop, channeling my nervous energy into organizing my tools and planning my day. The first order of business was coffee and a call to my best friend, Vince Martinez. Vince was an ex-cop turned private investigator who'd been telling me for months that Reina was up to something. I'd been too stubborn to listen at the time, but Vince had kept digging anyway. Good thing, too, because his information was about to become very valuable. "Rowan, you sound like garbage," Vince said when he picked up the phone. "Let me guess. The princess came home." "How did you know?" "Because I've been watching Luther's case, and I figured it was only a matter of time before she came running back to Daddy." "What did she want?" I filled him in on the previous night's conversation while I made breakfast. Vince listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I appreciated about him. He never jumped to conclusions or offered advice until he'd heard the whole story. "So she's claiming you're the father," he said when I finished. "That's bold, even for her. It's also stupid. The timeline doesn't work, and I've got evidence to prove it. Evidence is good, but it's not enough. She's going to fight dirty, and she's got nothing left to lose. You need to be proactive here." "What do you suggest?" "First, we make sure Luther's family knows about the baby. If they think there's a chance it could affect their son's case or their finances, they'll want to distance themselves from Reina as much as possible." That was brilliant. Luther came from old money, the kind of family that valued reputation above almost everything else. If they thought Reina and her baby could become a liability, they'd cut her loose without a second thought. "Second," Vince continued, "we need to get ahead of whatever story she's planning to tell. This town loves gossip, and she's going to try to paint you as the villain who abandoned his pregnant wife. How do we do that? Leave that to me. I've got some contacts at the courthouse who owe me favors. By the end of the day, the right people will know the real timeline of events." After I hung up with Vince, I spent the morning putting together a comprehensive file of everything I'd collected over the past 3 months. Bank records, credit card statements, phone records, photographs, and witness statements from people who'd seen Reina and Luther together. It was more thorough than most criminal investigations, and it painted a very clear picture of a woman who'd been planning her exit strategy for months. Around noon, I drove to the courthouse to file some preliminary paperwork. I wasn't ready to start divorce proceedings yet. That would come later when the timing was right. But I wanted to establish a paper trail that would protect me if Reina tried to make good on her threats. The courthouse in Bass Lake was one of those grand old buildings that had been built when the town was still a major logging center. High ceilings, marble floors, and the kind of solid construction that made my contractor's heart happy. I'd done some renovation work there a few years back, which meant I knew my way around and had a good relationship with most of the staff. "Rowan Kerrick," said Janet Holbrook, the clerk who handled most of the family law filings. "Haven't seen you in here for a while. What brings you by?" "Just filing some protective paperwork," I said, handing her a folder. "My wife left me a few months ago, and now she's trying to come back with some interesting claims." Janet was in her 50s, had worked at the courthouse for 20 years, and had seen every kind of family drama imaginable. She flipped through my documents with the practiced eye of someone who'd processed thousands of similar cases. "Paternity dispute?" she asked. "Among other things. I just want to make sure I'm protected if she tries to file false claims." "Smart thinking. These cases can get messy fast." She stamped my documents and handed me the copies. "You might want to talk to Tom Bradley about representation. He's handled some high-profile cases lately, and he's got a good reputation for protecting his clients." Tom Bradley was one of the best family law attorneys in the county, and his fees reflected that fact. But if Reina was planning to play hardball, I needed someone who could hit back just as hard. I was walking back to my truck when I spotted a familiar figure across the courthouse square. Sierra Walsh, Reina's best friend and business partner, was coming out of the coffee shop with her usual entourage of gossips and social climbers. She saw me at the same time I saw her, and her face immediately flushed red. Sierra was one of those women who thrived on drama and conflict. She'd been encouraging Reina's worst impulses for years, always pushing her to demand more, expect more, and settle for nothing less than perfection. If anyone had known about the affair from the beginning, it would have been Sierra. "Rowan?" she called out, her voice carrying across the square. "I heard Reina came to see you last night." I walked over to where she was standing, noting how her friends immediately closed ranks around her like she was some kind of celebrity. In a town the size of Bass Lake, I suppose she was. "News travels fast," I said. "She's really struggling, you know. Luther's situation has been devastating for her." "I'm sure it has been. It's always tough when your sugar daddy gets arrested." Sierra's friends gasped like I'd just committed blasphemy. These were the kind of women who spent their days at the country club, gossiping about their neighbors and pretending their own lives were perfect. "That's not fair," Sierra said. "Reina made some mistakes, but she's trying to do the right thing now." The right thing would have been not to have an affair in the first place, but I suppose that ship has sailed. "She's pregnant, Rowan. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" "Sure it does. It means she's going to be a mother. It doesn't mean I'm going to be a father." One of Sierra's friends, I think her name was Linda something, stepped forward. "How can you be so cold? That poor girl is carrying your child." "Actually, she's carrying Luther Braddock's child, but don't let facts get in the way of a good story." The group fell silent, and I could see the wheels turning in their heads as they processed this information. These women were the town's unofficial news network, and anything they heard would be spread to 50 other people by dinner time. "You're lying," Sierra said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Am I? Ask Reina when she got pregnant. Ask her where she was living in April. Ask her whose name is on the lease for that fancy lake house where she's been playing house for the past 3 months." I pulled out my phone and showed them a photograph I'd taken of Reina and Luther together at a restaurant in the next town over. The timestamp showed it was from 6 weeks ago, and they were clearly more than just business associates. "This is from last month," I said. "Does this look like a woman who was planning to come home to her husband?" Sierra grabbed the phone and stared at the photo, her face going pale. Where did you get this? Does it matter? The point is, your friend has been lying to everyone, including you. She didn't leave me because our marriage was in trouble. She left me because Luther offered her a better deal. I took my phone back and put it in my pocket. And now that Luther's deal has gone south, she wants to come crawling back to her backup plan. But here's the thing, ladies. I'm nobody's backup plan. I tipped my hat and walked away, leaving them to digest what they'd just learned. By the time I reached my truck, I could already hear them talking excitedly among themselves. The story would be all over town by evening, which was exactly what I wanted. The afternoon was spent meeting with Tom Bradley, who turned out to be exactly the kind of attorney I needed. He was in his early 50s, with gray hair and the kind of calm confidence that came from winning more cases than he lost. His office was decorated with law books and family photos, and he had the rare quality of being able to explain complex legal concepts in plain English. Based on what you've told me, and the evidence you've provided, he said after reviewing my file, I don't think you have much to worry about legally. The paternity claim is clearly false, and any competent judge will see through it immediately. What about her other threats? She mentioned spousal support and trying to claim part of the house. Again, not much substance there. You've been separated for 3 months. She left voluntarily, and she's been living with another man. No judge is going to award spousal support under those circumstances. So I'm in the clear? Tom leaned back in his chair and studied me carefully. Legally, yes. But I get the feeling there's more to this story than just a simple divorce case. What aren't you telling me? I appreciated his directness. I want to make sure she can't hurt me, but I also want to make sure she faces consequences for what she's done. She humiliated me in front of the entire town, and she's trying to stick me with responsibility for another man's child. That doesn't sit well with me. Revenge is a dangerous game, Rowan. It has a way of backfiring on people who aren't careful. I'm not talking about revenge. I'm talking about justice. There's a difference. Tom nodded slowly. Fair enough. Just remember that the law is a tool, not a weapon. Use it to protect yourself, not to destroy other people. That evening, I met Vince at the Crooked Lantern, the local dive bar where half the town went to drink away their problems. It was the kind of place where the beer was cheap, the music was loud, and everybody minded their own business unless you wanted them to get involved. Vince was already there when I arrived, nursing a beer and chatting with Mickey Torino, the bartender who'd been serving drinks in Bass Lake since before I was born. Mickey knew everyone's business, and he was surprisingly discreet about most of it. But he also understood the value of information, and he'd been helpful to Vince on more than one occasion. Rowan, Mickey said as I approached the bar. Heard you had some excitement last night. Word gets around fast. Faster when Sierra Walsh is involved. She was in here an hour ago, telling anyone who'd listen about your conversation at the courthouse. Vince grinned. I told you the gossip network would work in our favor. Half the town already knows Reina's baby isn't yours. What about Luther's family? Any word from them? Funny you should ask. Vince pulled out his phone and showed me a text message. Luther's mother called me this afternoon. Apparently someone told her about Reina's pregnancy, and she wants to meet with us tomorrow. Mrs. Eleanor Braddock was old money royalty in Bass Lake, the kind of woman who could trace her family back to the town's founding fathers. She lived in a mansion on the hill overlooking the lake, and she wielded more social and political influence than the mayor. If she was taking an interest in this situation, it meant things were about to get very interesting. What does she want? To make sure her son's legal troubles don't get any worse. A paternity claim from his mistress would be very bad for his case and very expensive for his family. I took a long drink of my beer and considered the implications. So we're talking about an alliance of convenience. Exactly. She wants Reina to go away, and so do you. Sometimes the enemy of your enemy really is your friend. The bar was starting to fill up with the usual crowd of construction workers, fishermen, and other folks who worked with their hands for a living. These were my people, honest, straightforward, and not impressed by fancy cars or big houses. They respected hard work and straight talk, and they had no patience for people who put on airs or thought they were better than everyone else. "Rowan Kerrick," called out a voice from across the room. I turned to see Bobby Hendricks, a plumber I'd worked with on several projects. "Heard your wife came home with a surprise." "Something like that," I replied. "Well, for what it's worth, most of us figured she was up to something when she started driving that fancy car around town. Nobody's income goes up that much that fast without some explaining to do." Several other guys nodded in agreement, and I realized that Reina's affair had been an open secret among the working-class crowd. They'd seen the signs that I'd missed, or maybe they'd just been more willing to acknowledge what was right in front of their faces. "Appreciate the support," I said. "Hey, we look out for our own," Bobby replied. "And anybody who'd walk out on a good man like you isn't worth crying over." As the evening wore on, I found myself feeling more optimistic about the situation. Reina had clearly expected me to roll over and accept her demands, but instead she was finding herself isolated and facing opposition from multiple directions. Her affair was no longer a secret. Her credibility was shot, and even her allies were starting to distance themselves from her. But I knew this was just the beginning. Reina was nothing if not resourceful, and she wouldn't give up easily. If she couldn't get what she wanted through manipulation and emotional blackmail, she'd try other tactics. The question was, what would her next move be? I didn't have to wait long to find out. I woke up the next morning to the sound of someone pounding on my front door. Not knocking, pounding, like they were trying to break it down. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand, 7:30 a.m., way too early for social calls, and definitely too early for whatever drama this was likely to be. I pulled on a pair of jeans and a t-shirt and headed downstairs, already having a pretty good idea of who was making all the noise. Sure enough, when I looked through the peephole, there was Reina standing on my front porch with what appeared to be a small army of reinforcements. Sierra was there, of course, along with Reina's sister Michelle and her husband Dave. Behind them stood a woman I didn't recognize, probably a lawyer, based on her expensive suit and briefcase. And bringing up the rear was Reina's mother, Patricia, who had never liked me and had made no secret of the fact that she thought her daughter had married beneath her station. I opened the door, but left the chain latch engaged, creating a gap just wide enough for conversation. "Morning, folks. You're up early." "Open this door, Rowan," Patricia demanded. "We need to talk." "Actually, we don't. I said everything I needed to say last night." Reina stepped forward, her eyes red from crying. "Rowan, please. I know you're angry, but we can work this out. I brought my lawyer so we can discuss a fair arrangement." "Fair arrangement?" I laughed. "That's rich. You want to discuss fairness after you spent 3 months living with another man?" The lawyer, a sharp-faced woman in her 40s, cleared her throat. "Mr. Kerrick, I'm Amanda Foster, and I represent Mrs. Kerrick. We're prepared to offer you a very reasonable settlement that would benefit everyone involved." "I'm listening." "Mrs. Kerrick is willing to waive any claim to spousal support if you'll acknowledge paternity of the child and provide appropriate child support payments." "Acknowledge paternity of a child that isn't mine? That's your idea of reasonable?" "The child was conceived during your marriage," Amanda Foster continued. "Under state law, there's a presumption of paternity that would be difficult to overcome." I had to give her credit. She was good. But Tom Bradley had already explained the legal realities to me, and I wasn't about to be intimidated by legal jargon and veiled threats. "Ms. Foster, was it? Here's what I know about state law. The presumption of paternity can be rebutted with clear and convincing evidence. And I've got plenty of that." I held up my phone, which contained copies of all the documentation I'd been collecting. Bank records, credit card statements, witness testimony, photographs, and security camera footage. All of it proving that my wife was living with Luther Braddock when this child was conceived. The color drained from Amanda Foster's face, and I could see her mentally recalculating her strategy. She'd clearly expected to steamroll me with legal threats and the presumption that I wouldn't fight back. Furthermore, I continued, any attempt to file false paternity claims would constitute fraud, which is a felony. And given that Luther Braddock is currently under federal investigation, I'm betting the prosecutors would be very interested in any additional criminal activity involving his associates. You're threatening my daughter, Patricia said, her voice shaking with rage. I'm not threatening anyone, I'm simply explaining the legal realities of the situation. Your daughter made her choice when she walked out that door 3 months ago. Now she has to live with the consequences. Michelle, who had been quiet up to this point, finally spoke up. Rowan, I know Reina made mistakes, but she's family, and that baby is innocent in all of this. You're absolutely right. The baby is innocent, which is why Luther Braddock should step up and take responsibility for his child instead of hiding behind his lawyers and letting your sister try to pin it on me. Luther's in prison, Sierra said. He can't exactly step up right now. That's not my problem. Reina chose to get involved with a criminal. She chose to get pregnant by a man who was running illegal business schemes. Those were her decisions, and now she gets to deal with the consequences. Dave, Michelle's husband, had been standing quietly in the background, but now he stepped forward. Look, Rowan, I get that you're hurt, but Reina needs help, and you're the only one who can provide it. Dave was a decent guy who'd gotten caught up in family drama that wasn't his fault. I actually felt sorry for him, but that didn't change the fundamental facts of the situation. Dave, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm not a charity case, and I'm not a backup plan. Reina made it very clear that she didn't want to be married to me when she moved in with Luther. I'm simply respecting her decision. What if we could arrange a financial settlement? Amanda Foster asked. Something that would compensate you for your time and trouble while ensuring the child has adequate support? You mean like a bribe? I mean like a mutually beneficial arrangement that avoids a lengthy and expensive court battle. I pretended to consider her offer while I pulled out my own phone and started recording the conversation. Ms. Foster, are you suggesting that I accept money in exchange for claiming paternity of a child that isn't mine? She realized her mistake immediately. That's not what I said. It sounded like that's exactly what you said. In fact, I'm pretty sure that would constitute conspiracy to commit fraud, which would make you an accessory to a felony. Amanda Foster snapped her briefcase shut and stepped back from the door. I think this conversation is over. I think you're right, I agreed. But before you go, let me make something crystal clear. I'm not signing any papers, I'm not accepting any money, and I'm not taking responsibility for Luther Braddock's child. If you want to pursue this through the courts, you're welcome to try, but I promise you, it won't end well for your client. After they left, I called Vince to fill him in on the morning's events. He was already on his way to meet with Mrs. Braddock, and he suggested I join him for what was sure to be an interesting conversation. Eleanor Braddock's mansion was a testament to old money and good taste. Built in the 1920s by her grandfather, it sat on 5 acres of perfectly manicured grounds overlooking Bass Lake. The house itself was a masterpiece of colonial architecture, with white columns, black shutters, and the kind of solid construction that would last for centuries. Mrs. Braddock received us in her sitting room, a formal space decorated with antique furniture and family portraits that traced the Braddock lineage back to the Revolutionary War. She was in her 70s, but carried herself with the kind of dignity and authority that came from a lifetime of social prominence. Mr. Kerrick, she said, offering her hand, I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances, but I appreciate you taking the time to see me. Mrs. Braddock, I have to say I'm curious about what you want to discuss. She gestured for us to sit down, then poured tea from an elegant silver service. Everything about the scene was designed to remind visitors of her family's status and influence, but it was done with such understated class that it didn't feel like showing off. I'll get straight to the point, she said. My son has made some very poor decisions, both in business and in his personal life. His relationship with your wife was inappropriate and damaging to
In my house! You bastard!
Relax, man. It's just business.
Please, don't shoot!
Get off!
You won't do it. You don't have the guts.
Don't! Please don't shoot him! Please! I'm begging you! Don't do this! No! Please, no!
everyone involved. I appreciate your honesty. However, I want to make sure that his legal troubles don't get any worse than they already are. A paternity claim from Mrs. Kerrick could complicate his case significantly, and it could expose our family to additional financial liability. What are you proposing? I'm proposing that we work together to ensure Mrs. Kerrick understands that pursuing false paternity claims would not be in anyone's best interest. Vince leaned forward. What kind of leverage are we talking about? Mrs. Braddock smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. Mr. Martinez, my family has been prominent in this community for over a century. We have relationships with judges, prosecutors, law enforcement officials, and business leaders throughout the region. If Mrs. Kerrick chooses to pursue frivolous legal action, she may find that her other business interests suffer as a result. You're talking about her fitness studio. Among other things, the building she leases is owned by one of our family trusts. Her business license requires annual renewal by the city council. Her insurance is provided by companies that value their relationship with our family. I'm not suggesting we would do anything improper, but business relationships can be fragile. I had to admit, I was impressed. Mrs. Braddock was offering to use her influence to squeeze Reina financially, which would be far more effective than any legal maneuvering. A woman facing bankruptcy and business failure would be much less likely to pursue expensive court battles. What do you want in return? I want your assurance that you won't pursue any legal action against my son personally. No civil suits, no attempts to involve him in your divorce proceedings, no public statements that could damage his reputation further. It was a fair deal. Luther was already facing federal charges that would likely send him to prison for years. I didn't need to pile on with additional lawsuits, and I certainly didn't need the hassle of getting dragged into his criminal case. Done, I said, but I want something else in return. What's that? I want Luther to formally acknowledge paternity of Reina's baby. Not for financial support. I understand his assets are frozen, but for the legal record. I want it documented that he's the father, not me. Mrs. Braddock considered this for a moment. That could be arranged. In fact, it might be beneficial for his case if he demonstrates responsibility for his actions. We shook hands on the deal, and I left feeling like I'd gained a powerful ally. Mrs. Braddock had the resources and connections to make Reina's life very difficult, and she had every incentive to do so. It was a perfect alignment of interests. That afternoon, I received a call from Tom Bradley with an interesting piece of news. Apparently, Amanda Foster had contacted his office to discuss the possibility of a settlement conference. She's fishing, Tom explained, trying to figure out how strong our case is and whether you're serious about fighting this. What did you tell her? I told her that my client has extensive documentation supporting his position and that any paternity claims would be vigorously contested. I also mentioned that filing false claims could result in criminal charges. How did she respond? She got very quiet very quickly. I think she's starting to realize that this case isn't the easy payday she thought it would be. That evening, I decided to take a drive around town to see how the gossip mill was working. Bass Lake was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and public opinion could be a powerful force in situations like this. My first stop was the hardware store, where I needed to pick up some supplies for a job I was starting next week. The owner, Frank Delacroix, had been selling tools and building materials in Bass Lake for 30 years, and he was plugged into the local construction community. "Rowan," he said as I walked in, "heard you've been having some domestic troubles." "Nothing I can't handle, Frank." "Good to hear. For what it's worth, most of the guys around here think you're getting a raw deal. That wife of yours was always a little too fancy for her own good." I picked up my supplies and chatted with a few other contractors who were in the store. The consensus was clear. Reina had overplayed her hand, and the local working-class community was firmly on my side. My next stop was the grocery store, where I ran into Janet Holbrook from the courthouse. She was off duty, but she still had that official bearing that came from years of dealing with legal paperwork. "Rowan," she said quietly, "I probably shouldn't tell you this, but there's been some interesting activity in the family court filings today." "Oh?" "Someone filed an emergency motion for temporary spousal support and child support. The hearing is scheduled for next week." So Reina was moving forward with her legal threats. That was fine with me. I was ready for a court battle, and I had the evidence to win it decisively. "Thanks for the heads up, Janet. Just remember, these cases can get ugly fast. Make sure you've got good representation." My final stop was the Crooked Lantern, where I found Mickey behind the bar as usual. The place was busy for a weeknight, filled with the usual mix of blue-collar workers and local characters. "Rowan," Mickey called out as I approached the bar. "You just missed your wife. She was in here about an hour ago with that lawyer of hers." "Really? What were they discussing?" "Couldn't hear much, but they seemed pretty agitated about something. The lawyer kept checking her phone and shaking her head." I ordered a beer and found a quiet corner where I could observe the room without being obvious about it. Bass Lake was a small town, and the bar was one of the few places where people from different social circles mixed together. Information flowed freely here, and alliances were formed and broken over drinks and casual conversation. About 20 minutes later, Sierra Walsh walked in with two women I didn't recognize. They took a table near the back and immediately started talking in hushed tones. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language suggested they were discussing something serious. I was finishing my beer when my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "This isn't over. You'll regret the way you've treated me. R." I showed the message to Mickey, who shook his head in disgust. "That woman just doesn't know when to quit, does she?" "Apparently not." "Well, for what it's worth, she's not winning any popularity contests around here. Word is getting around about what really happened, and most folks think she's got a lot of nerve coming back here expecting you to clean up her mess." I finished my beer and headed home, feeling satisfied with the day's progress. Reina's legal team was clearly having second thoughts about their strategy. Mrs. Braddock was applying pressure from her end, and public opinion was turning against my soon-to-be ex-wife. But I knew this was far from over. Reina was desperate, and desperate people did unpredictable things. Her text message suggested she was planning some kind of retaliation, which meant I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed a car parked across the street that hadn't been there when I left. It was a dark sedan with tinted windows, and it looked like the kind of vehicle that private investigators or process servers might use. I made a mental note to mention it to Vince in the morning. If Reina was having me watched or followed, it meant she was planning something more sophisticated than simple legal maneuvering. The game was definitely escalating, but I was ready for whatever she wanted to throw at me. After all, I'd been preparing for this moment for 3 months. The emergency court hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning, which gave me 3 days to prepare for what I expected would be Reina's last desperate attempt to get what she wanted through legal means. Tom Bradley had filed our response papers, which included a comprehensive timeline of events and a preview of the evidence we intended to present. Wednesday evening, I was in my workshop putting the finishing touches on a custom cabinet when Vince called with urgent news. "Rowan, you need to get down to the courthouse right now. Reina just filed additional papers claiming domestic violence and requesting a restraining order. I set down my tools and grabbed my keys. Domestic violence? That's insane. I've never laid a hand on her. I know that. And you know that. But the judge doesn't know that. These kinds of allegations can be very damaging, even if they're completely false. The courthouse was closed for regular business, but there was an emergency hearing room that handled urgent matters like restraining order requests. When I arrived, Tom Bradley was already there, looking grim as he reviewed a stack of papers. "This is bad, Rowan," he said without preamble. "She's claiming that you threatened her with physical violence during your conversation on Monday night, and that you've been harassing her through intermediaries. That's complete nonsense. I recorded our entire conversation, and there were no threats of any kind. Do you still have the recording?" "Of course." I pulled out my phone and played back the relevant portions of Monday night's conversation. Tom listened carefully, taking notes as the recording played. "This actually helps us," he said when the recording finished. "Her allegations are very specific, and they don't match what's on this recording at all. So we can get the restraining order dismissed? Probably, but it might take a few days. In the meantime, you're legally prohibited from contacting her or going within 500 feet of her residence. Where is she living?" "According to the filing, she's staying with her sister, Michelle." That was interesting. Michelle lived in a modest ranch house on the other side of town, which was a significant step down from Luther's lake house. It suggested that Reina's financial situation was more desperate than I'd realized. The emergency hearing was held in a small courtroom with just the judge, a court reporter, and the attorneys present. Judge Patricia Henley was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had a reputation for being tough but fair. I'd appeared before her a few times over the years for various business-related matters, and she'd always struck me as someone who didn't tolerate games or manipulation. Amanda Foster presented Reina's case first, painting a picture of an abusive husband who had threatened his pregnant wife and was using his connections to harass and intimidate her. She was good. I had to give her that. If I hadn't known the truth, I might have been convinced by her performance. Tom Bradley's response was surgical in its precision. He played the recording of Monday night's conversation, which completely contradicted Reina's allegations. He presented evidence of her affair with Luther, documentation of when she had left the marital home, and proof that she had been living with another man for months. "Your Honor," Tom said in conclusion, "this restraining order request is nothing more than a tactical maneuver designed to gain advantage in what is clearly going to be a contentious divorce proceeding. Mrs. Kerrick has provided no credible evidence of domestic violence, and the evidence we've presented proves that her allegations are false." Judge Henley reviewed the materials for several minutes before rendering her decision. "Ms. Foster, your client's allegations are serious, but they're not supported by the evidence presented here. The recording clearly contradicts her version of events, and I'm troubled by the timing of this request. Your Honor, domestic violence victims often delay reporting incidents because they're afraid. Ms. Foster, I've been handling domestic violence cases for 15 years. I know what real abuse looks like, and this isn't it. The temporary restraining order is denied." Amanda Foster's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. She'd clearly expected the judge to rubber stamp the request without much scrutiny, and instead, she'd been publicly dressed down for filing frivolous paperwork. "However," Judge Henley continued, "I'm going to order both parties to refrain from direct contact with each other, except through their attorneys, until the divorce proceedings are resolved. And Ms. Foster, if you file any more emergency motions without substantial evidence to support them, I'll consider sanctions for abuse of the court's time." As we left the courthouse, Tom pulled me aside. "That went better than I expected, but you need to be careful. Reina's getting desperate, and desperate people do unpredictable things." "What do you think her next move will be?" "Hard to say. She's running out of legal options, and her credibility with the court is shot, but that might make her more dangerous, not less." I drove home feeling cautiously optimistic. Reina's legal strategy was falling apart, her financial situation was deteriorating, and she was facing increasing social isolation as word of her affair spread through the community. But Tom was right. Desperate people were unpredictable, and I needed to stay alert. Thursday morning brought the main event, the hearing on Reina's motion for temporary spousal support and child support. The courtroom was packed with spectators, which wasn't unusual for high-profile divorce cases in a small town. I spotted several familiar faces in the gallery, including Sierra Walsh, Michelle, and Dave, and even Mrs. Braddock, who was sitting in the back row with the kind of regal bearing that commanded attention. Judge Henley called the case to order and listened as Amanda Foster presented Reina's argument for financial support. She painted a picture of a vulnerable pregnant woman who had been abandoned by her husband and was facing financial hardship through no fault of her own. Mrs. Kerrick is currently unemployed and has no source of income, Amanda argued. She's carrying Mr. Kerrick's child and deserves financial support during this difficult time. Tom Bradley's cross-examination of Reina was a masterclass in courtroom strategy. He methodically walked through the timeline of her relationship with Luther, her decision to leave the marital home, and her current living arrangements. Mrs. Kerrick, when did you first begin your romantic relationship with Mr. Braddock? We were just friends at first. That's not what I asked. When did your relationship become romantic? Reina glanced nervously at her attorney. I don't remember exactly. Tom pulled out a folder of bank records. These records show large deposits into your business account beginning in February. Were these payments from Mr. Braddock? They were business investments. What kind of business investments require you to spend weekends at his lake house? Objection, Amanda Foster called out. Relevance? Goes to the witness's credibility and the timeline of events, Your Honor. I'll allow it. Tom continued his methodical destruction of Reina's credibility, presenting evidence of her affair, her voluntary departure from the marital home, and her extended cohabitation with Luther. By the time he finished, it was clear that Reina's claims of abandonment were completely false. The paternity issue was handled more delicately, but no less effectively. Tom presented medical evidence showing that the baby had been conceived in April, weeks after Reina had moved in with Luther. He also presented a signed affidavit from Luther himself, acknowledging paternity of the child. Wait, Amanda Foster said, clearly surprised. Where did this affidavit come from? Mr. Braddock's attorney provided it yesterday, Tom replied smoothly. Apparently, Mr. Braddock wants to take responsibility for his actions, even while incarcerated. I had to hand it to Mrs. Braddock. She'd delivered on her promise faster than I'd expected. Having Luther formally acknowledge paternity eliminated any legal ambiguity about the child's parentage. Judge Henley's ruling was swift and decisive. Based on the evidence presented, I find that Mrs. Kerrick voluntarily left the marital home to cohabit with another man, that the child she's carrying was fathered by that other man, and that her claims for spousal and child support are without merit. Furthermore, the judge continued, I'm troubled by what appears to be a pattern of false allegations and frivolous legal filings. Ms. Foster, I'm ordering your client to pay Mr. Kerrick's attorney fees for having to defend against these baseless claims. The courtroom erupted in whispers and murmurs as the implications of the judge's ruling sank in. Reina had not only lost her case decisively, but she was now facing additional financial penalties for pursuing it in the first place. As we left the courthouse, I could see Reina standing on the steps with her family, arguing in hushed tones with Amanda Foster. Sierra was there too, looking uncomfortable and checking her phone repeatedly. The whole group had the defeated air of an army that had just suffered a devastating defeat. How much will she have to pay in attorney fees? I asked Tom as we walked to our cars. Probably around $15,000, based on the time I've put into this case. Given her current financial situation, that's going to hurt. That afternoon, I received a call from Vince with an interesting update. Mrs. Braddock's people have been busy. Reina's lease on the fitness studio is being terminated for non-payment of rent, and the city council is reviewing her business license for irregularities. What kind of irregularities? Turns out some of the improvements to her studio were done without proper permits, and there are questions about whether she's been reporting all of her income for tax purposes. So she's facing a complete financial collapse. Pretty much. And with Luther's assets frozen and her legal bills mounting, she doesn't have many options left. That evening, I decided to celebrate my victory with dinner at Marcello's, the nicest restaurant in Bass Lake. It was the kind of place where the town's elite went to see and be seen, and I wanted to make a public statement about my confidence and success. I was halfway through my meal when Sierra Walsh approached my table. She looked nervous and kept glancing around like she was afraid someone might see her talking to me. "Rowan, can I sit down? I need to talk to you." I gestured to the empty chair across from me. "Sure, Sierra. What's on your mind?" "I want to apologize for my part in all of this. I should have stayed out of it, and I shouldn't have encouraged Reina to pursue those legal claims." "Apology accepted. Is there something else?" Sierra glanced around the restaurant again, then leaned forward and lowered her voice. "Reina's planning something. I don't know what, but she's been making phone calls and meeting with people I don't recognize." "What kind of people?" "I don't know, but they don't look like lawyers or family members, and she's been asking weird questions about your work schedule and your daily routines." That was concerning. If Reina was having me surveilled or planning some kind of confrontation, I needed to be prepared. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I've known Reina for 10 years, and I've never seen her like this. She's not thinking clearly, and I'm worried she might do something stupid." "Define stupid." "I don't know. But she keeps talking about how you've humiliated her and how she needs to make you pay for what you've done. That doesn't sound like someone who's planning to just walk away quietly." After Sierra left, I called Vince and filled him in on the conversation. He agreed that it was cause for concern and suggested we take some precautions. "I'll do some checking and see if I can figure out who she's been talking to. In the meantime, you should vary your routines and maybe consider staying somewhere else for a few days." "I'm not running from my own house." "I'm not suggesting you run. I'm suggesting you be smart. If she's planning something, you don't want to make it easy for her." That night, I made sure all my doors and windows were locked, and I kept my phone close by in case I needed to call for help. I also reviewed the security camera footage from the past few days, looking for any signs that someone had been watching the house. Around midnight, I was awakened by the sound of a car engine running outside. I looked out my bedroom window and saw a dark sedan parked across the street, the same type of car I'd noticed earlier in the week. This time, I could see someone sitting in the driver's seat. I called the police and reported a suspicious vehicle, then watched as a patrol car arrived about 10 minutes later. The sedan immediately drove away, but not before I managed to get a partial license plate number. The next morning, Vince ran the plate number and discovered that the car was registered to a private investigation firm in the next county. "She's definitely having you watched," he confirmed. "The question is why. Maybe she's looking for evidence that I'm hiding assets or income. Maybe, or maybe she's planning something more direct." As if on cue, my phone rang. It was Tom Bradley, and he sounded concerned. "Rowan, I just got a call from Amanda Foster. She wants to schedule a settlement conference for early next week." "I thought we already settled this in court." "We did, but she's claiming that Reina has new information that could change the outcome of the divorce proceedings." "What kind of new information?" "She wouldn't say, but she seemed confident that it would be worth your while to hear what they have to offer." I had a bad feeling about this development. Reina had lost every legal battle so far, but she was clearly not ready to give up. Whatever she was planning, it was going to be her final gambit, and that made it potentially very dangerous. "Set up the meeting," I told Tom, "but make sure it's in a public place with plenty of witnesses. I don't trust her not to try something desperate." As I hung up the phone, I realized that the game was entering its final phase. Reina was cornered, desperate, and apparently planning one last move to try to salvage something from the wreckage of her schemes. I'd been preparing for this moment for months, but I knew that the most dangerous part was still ahead of me. The settlement conference was scheduled for Tuesday afternoon at Tom Bradley's office, which was located in a professional building downtown. I arrived early and spent a few minutes reviewing my strategy with Tom while we waited for Reina and her attorney to arrive. "Remember," Tom said, "whatever they're planning to offer, don't react emotionally. Let me handle the negotiations, and don't agree to anything without discussing it first." At exactly 2 o'clock, Amanda Foster arrived with Reina and a man I didn't recognize. He was in his 40s, well-dressed, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that suggested he was used to getting his way. Amanda introduced him as Richard Castellanos, a specialist in complex family law cases. "Mr. Kerrick," Richard said, offering his hand. "I've heard a lot about you." "I'm sure you have." We settled into Tom's conference room, and Amanda Foster opened the discussion. "Gentlemen, my client is prepared to make a very generous offer that would resolve all outstanding issues between the parties." "I'm listening," Tom replied. Richard Castellanos pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. "Mrs. Kerrick is willing to waive all claims to spousal support, property division, and attorney fees if Mr. Kerrick will agree to a one-time payment of $50,000. "In exchange for what?" I asked. "In exchange for your silence about the circumstances of your marriage's breakdown. No public statements, no social media posts, no discussions with members of the media." I looked at Tom, who was studying the proposal with a poker face. "They want to buy my silence." "It appears so." Reina spoke for the first time since entering the room. "Rowan, I know you're angry with me, and you have every right to be. But continuing this public battle isn't helping anyone. Let's just end this quietly and move on with our lives." "That's a very reasonable request," Richard added. "Mr. Kerrick has already achieved everything he wanted in court. This would simply formalize the end of your relationship and provide Mrs. Kerrick with the resources she needs to start over." I pretended to consider the offer while I tried to figure out what Reina's real angle was. $50,000 was a significant amount of money, but it wasn't enough to solve her financial problems long-term. There had to be something else going on. "Where would this $50,000 come from?" I asked. Last I heard, Reina was facing bankruptcy. Richard and Amanda exchanged glances before Richard answered. "Mrs. Kerrick has secured private financing for this settlement." "From whom?" "That's confidential." Now I was really suspicious. Reina didn't have any wealthy friends or family members who could loan her that kind of money, and Luther's assets were frozen. Someone else was bankrolling this settlement offer. But who? "I need to think about this," I said. "It's a generous offer, but I want to review it with my attorney before making a decision." "Of course," Richard replied, "but we would need an answer by Friday. The financing for this settlement is time-sensitive." After they left, Tom and I discussed the proposal. He was as suspicious as I was about the source of the money and the urgency of the timeline. "This feels like a trap," Tom said. "They're offering you a significant amount of money to keep quiet about something, but we don't know what that something is. Maybe they're worried about the criminal implications of her affair with Luther. If she was involved in his business dealings, she could be facing charges herself." "That's possible. Or maybe there's something else we don't know about yet." I decided to call Vince and get his perspective on the situation. He agreed to do some digging and see what he could find out about Richard Castellanos and the source of the settlement money. Wednesday morning, Vince called with disturbing news. Richard Castellanos specializes in cases involving organized crime figures and high-profile corruption scandals. He's expensive, and his clients usually have serious legal problems. What does that tell us? It tells us that Reina's situation is more complicated than we thought. Nobody hires a lawyer like Castellanos for a simple divorce case. Any idea where the settlement money is coming from? I'm still working on that, but I have some theories. Luther's business dealings were more extensive than we realized, and there are rumors that he was involved with some very unsavory people. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor at my workshop. Mrs. Braddock arrived in a black town car, driven by a uniformed chauffeur, and she was clearly agitated about something. "Mr. Kerrick, I need to speak with you urgently. May I come in?" I led her into my workshop, which was probably the first time someone of her social standing had ever set foot in such a place. She looked around with interest at the tools and equipment, but her mind was clearly on other matters. "I've learned something disturbing about Mrs. Kerrick's settlement offer," she said without preamble. "The money is coming from associates of my son who are attempting to buy your silence about certain business transactions." "What kind of business transactions?" "The kind that could implicate Mrs. Kerrick in my son's criminal activities. Apparently, she was more involved in his business dealings than anyone realized." Mrs. Braddock explained that Luther's business empire had been built on a foundation of bribery, money laundering, and fraud. Reina hadn't just been his mistress, she'd been an active participant in several of his schemes, using her fitness studio to launder money and her social connections to identify potential victims. "The FBI is expanding their investigation," Mrs. Braddock continued. "They're looking at everyone who was involved with Luther's business operations, and Mrs. Kerrick is definitely on their radar. So the settlement offer is an attempt to keep me from cooperating with the FBI." "Exactly. If you accept their money and agree to stay silent, you could be charged as an accessory after the fact." This changed everything. Reina wasn't just trying to escape the consequences of her affair. She was trying to avoid federal prosecution for financial crimes, and she was willing to drag me down with her if necessary. I called Tom Bradley and filled him in on what Mrs. Braddock had told me. He was alarmed by the implications and advised me to contact the FBI immediately. "If they're trying to buy your silence about criminal activity, that's obstruction of justice. You need to report this before you get caught up in their web." Thursday morning, I met with Special Agent Sarah Chen of the FBI's white-collar crime unit. She was in her 30s, sharp-eyed, and clearly familiar with Luther's case. "Mr. Kerrick, we've been aware of your wife's involvement in Mr. Braddock's activities for some time. We were hoping you might be willing to cooperate with our investigation." "What kind of cooperation?" "We'd like you to accept their settlement offer and record any conversations where they discuss the reasons for wanting your silence. It would help us build a stronger case against the people who are financing this obstruction attempt." Agent Chen explained that the FBI had been investigating Luther's criminal network for over a year, and they believed Reina was a key figure in several money laundering operations. The settlement offer was actually an opportunity to gather evidence against the people who were trying to cover up their crimes. "What are the risks to me?" "Minimal, if you follow our instructions. You'd be working under FBI supervision, and we'd provide you with recording equipment and legal protection." I agreed to cooperate with the FBI investigation, which meant I had to go back to Tom's office on Friday and pretend to seriously consider Reina's settlement offer. The Friday meeting was tense from the moment I walked into the conference room. Reina looked nervous, Amanda Foster seemed uncomfortable, and Richard Castellanos was clearly impatient to get the deal signed. "Mr. Kerrick," Richard said, "I trust you've had time to consider our offer." "I have, and I'm inclined to accept it. But I have some questions about the terms." I spent the next hour asking detailed questions about the settlement agreement, focusing particularly on the confidentiality provisions. Richard became increasingly specific about what I would and wouldn't be allowed to discuss, and he made several statements that clearly constituted obstruction of justice. "To be absolutely clear," I said at one point, "you're asking me not to discuss Mrs. Kerrick's business relationship with Luther Braddock with anyone, including law enforcement officials?" "That's correct. The confidentiality agreement would cover all aspects of your marriage and its dissolution. Even if law enforcement officials specifically asked me about those business relationships?" Richard paused, clearly realizing he was walking into dangerous territory. "You would be required to refer any such inquiries to your attorney." And if I violated the confidentiality agreement by discussing these matters with law enforcement, you would be subject to significant financial penalties and potential legal action. Perfect. Richard had just confessed on tape to attempting to obstruct a federal investigation. I'll need the weekend to review the final paperwork with my attorney, I said. Can we schedule another meeting for Monday to finalize everything? Of course, Richard replied, clearly relieved that I was moving forward with the deal. After they left, I met with Agent Chen to review the recording. She was pleased with what we'd captured and explained that they would be making arrests early Monday morning. We'll need you to go through with the Monday meeting as planned. Once they hand over the settlement check, we'll have them on conspiracy charges as well as obstruction. Monday morning arrived gray and rainy, which seemed appropriate for what was going to be a very dramatic day. I arrived at Tom's office at the scheduled time, wearing the recording equipment the FBI had provided. Reina, Amanda, and Richard were already there, along with the settlement check and final paperwork. Richard seemed eager to get everything signed and concluded as quickly as possible. Mr. Kerrick, he said, if you'll just sign here, we can finalize this agreement and put this unfortunate situation behind us. I was reaching for the pen when the conference room door burst open and Agent Chen entered with 2 other FBI agents. Nobody move, Agent Chen announced, displaying her badge. Richard Castellanos, you're under arrest for conspiracy to obstruct justice and conspiracy to commit money laundering. The room erupted in chaos as the agents moved to arrest Richard and Amanda. Reina sat frozen in her chair, her face white with shock and terror. Rowan Kerrick, Agent Chen continued, you're also under arrest for conspiracy to commit money laundering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. As the agents read Reina her rights and led her away in handcuffs, she looked back at me with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. You set me up, she said. No, I replied. You set yourself up. I just refused to go down with you. After the arrests were made, Agent Chen explained what would happen next. Reina and her co-conspirators would be charged with multiple federal crimes related to their attempts to obstruct the investigation into Luther's criminal enterprise. What about the divorce? I asked Tom. That should be straightforward now. With Reina facing federal charges, there won't be any more frivolous motions or settlement demands. We can finalize everything quickly and quietly. That afternoon, I drove to the Crooked Lantern to decompress and process everything that had happened. Mickey was behind the bar as usual, and the place was buzzing with news of the morning's arrests. Rowan, Mickey called out as I approached the bar. Heard you had quite a morning. You could say that. Well, for what it's worth, most folks around here think justice was served. That woman caused you nothing but trouble, and she finally got what was coming to her. I ordered a beer and found a quiet corner where I could think about the future. The past few months had been exhausting, but I'd emerged victorious. Reina was facing years in federal prison, her co-conspirators were in custody, and I was finally free to move on with my life. My phone buzzed with a text message from Vince. Saw the news? Drinks tonight to celebrate? I typed back, absolutely, I'll buy the first round. As I sat in that familiar bar, surrounded by people who had supported me through the worst period of my life, I realized that I'd learned something important about myself. I wasn't the pushover that Reina had thought I was, and I wasn't going to let anyone take advantage of me again. The devil I'd known was finally gone, and I was ready to see what came next. 2 weeks later, the divorce was finalized. Reina pled guilty to federal charges and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Luther received 10 years for his role in the criminal enterprise. The fitness studio was sold to pay restitution to the victims of their schemes. I kept the house, kept my business, and kept my dignity. Most importantly, I kept my freedom. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be a victim.